A woman stands inside a workshop, meticulously planing by hand a piece of wood that will soon become a table. A rattling at the window draws her attention away from her work. There, two young men are watching her, their faces pressed tightly against the glass, noses flattened, and eyes wide. "Hey, Charles, come over and see this bitch over here. She thinks that she's a cabinet maker," one yells to a friend. "Do you think she knows how to hold a saw?" The year is 1916, and the woman in the workshop is Anny Berntsen. She is a cabinet maker in Copenhagen, and yes, she can wield a saw like nobody's business. In fact, she owns the shop she is currently standing in. The bell rings as another customer waltzes in, asking to speak to the master carpenter. "That's me," she says. He stares at her open-mouthed. He clearly has not read the sign by the door, where the small print reads, "Lady Cabinet Maker." As you might guess, in 1916, most Danish women didn't become cabinet makers. Although poor women have always worked throughout Danish history, especially women in the countryside, the world of handicrafts often belonged to the men. Of course, there is a notable exception for weaving and embroidery, which were female disciplines. However, architecture, art, construction, and carpentry were all firmly male disciplines in the late 19th and early 20th century. During this time period, the role of the woman was the homemaker, to take care of the children and run the household. But in the early 1900s, Anny Berntsen decided to learn her own craft and become a master carpenter. This was a decision that was scandalous at the time, as her father was an esteemed politician. In Annie's own words, it was not just the local boys that were amazed by the bitch who is a carpenter. Her photo and story traveled around the world in articles both deriding and praising her decision to enter a trade. To become a carpenter in Denmark, you typically learn at a trade school, as well as complete an apprenticeship under another master carpenter. The graduating exam then demonstrates the skills that you have learned. For carpenter apprentices looking to go into cabinet making, one must typically complete a piece of furniture that clearly demonstrates one's skill level. I have seen all manner of impressive pieces from current cabinet maker graduates in Denmark that sometimes involve motor-run toys and secret compartments. After this exam, the apprentice would then be presented with a journeyman's letter that allowed him to call himself a master carpenter and begin his own business. All of this was relatively straightforward for a man looking to become a carpenter, but for women back then it was significantly harder. Most women were not welcome in trade schools. However, ironically, some handicraft schools employed women as teachers, as teaching was a common trade for women. Sophie A. Christensen, the first female master carpenter in Denmark, actually was first going to learn to become a craft teacher. She only decided to become a carpenter because the Danish Women's Society pressed her to consider it instead. The Danish Women's Society, which you may remember from my first video on the women's exhibition, was a politically active group during this time period for women's rights. In 1887, they began a committee to support the education of craftswomen. This politically engaged support was necessary to allow women to enter this domain. Members of the Danish Women's Society financed the women's studies, gave them a place to stay, and even introduced them to the necessary network to make their education a success. Luckily, there were a few female accepting schools in Copenhagen that began to open at the turn of the 19th century. The Tegner- og Kunstindustriskole for kvinder opened in 1875 and taught women how to draw technically. Sophie A. Christensen attended this school. Then there was the Richard School that taught both women and men the art of crafts from 1886. This was the school that Anny attended. But even after attending school, the second barrier for a craftswoman was finding a place that would allow her to apprentice for them. Most workshops didn't allow female apprentices even into the 1930s. Women ended up apprenticing under other women, in an underground network of sorts, and many of these apprenticeships had connections to the Danish Women's Society. Anny ended up apprenticing under Katrine Horsbø, a cabinet maker whose work became famous during the women's exhibition. What's interesting is that this pattern and hidden network of women supporting other craftswomen in the trade industry is one that would continue throughout the golden age of Danish design. But that's a video for another day. In any case, by 1913, at age 19, Anny had received her journeyman papers. And she wasn't alone. Two other women that she'd attended the Richard School with also received their papers. The Danish Women's Society was delighted and featured their story as a success. They wrote in their own magazine that even before any of these young girls had seen the light, the Danish Women's Society cleared the stones that stood in the way of women's education as craftsmen. But Annie's high point of her career would actually come in 1917. She received a prestigious task, the task of creating the lectern for Parliament out of a gigantic stump. Although some sources state that her shop was in Copenhagen and that she was chosen because she was local, it is also rather likely that her father's political connections had something to do with it, especially given that he was a member of Parliament during this time period and a previous state minister. He even had brought the law proposal on women's suffrage to the floor of Parliament. Connections or not, however, Annie had undeniable skill as a craftswoman. The lectern was created without any nails or seams. It also had to be completely sanded by hand, as there was no machine capable of the task back then. When it was delivered in 1918 after only 6 months of work, again Annie made the papers, with many journalists praising her abilities. With such a success for the young craftswoman, we might expect her career trajectory to flourish after this prestigious job. But it appears that Annie was actually deeply concerned about the role that women and that she should play in society. Despite her pioneering success with her own education and business, and possible support of women's suffrage given her father's stance, in 1916 Annie expressed her concerns to the local paper. She wanted people to know that she considered women unsuitable for politics. This is not shocking given the time period and given the response that Annie received to opening her own business, which you heard at the beginning of this video. When you grow up constantly doubted for your own abilities solely due to your gender, and in a time period with very strict gender roles and expectations, it's very hard to break past that. Annie even received a letter from another Danish woman shaming her for entering a trade and telling her that she should be at home helping with the preservation of the descendants. And perhaps these words struck deeply. Annie was in love with her crafts teacher, Christian Burr. She eventually married him and was deeply conflicted over how to compromise her role as a craftswoman with one as a mother and a wife. In her mind, the two could not coexist. So when interviewed in 1924 for House and Home, she shared that she had sold her shop as she had to focus on her womanly abilities. This particular quote on whether or not women will ever be able to have a role in designing furniture is somewhat heartbreaking, as I can't help but think it reveals what she must have heard over her lifetime. She says, "Women have not the strengths or the brain to take up the fight with men. The development has shown that women are now educated more than before, which is why they naturally want to utilize their new skills. But ultimately it ends up that they want to get married, and the rest who don't want to be women, well, what do they become?" In the article, she goes on to say that she is not abandoning her business forever. Someday, when her children are grown and she is old and gray, she hopes to continue making small things. Sadly, this would never happen. Instead, Annie went through a series of personal tragedies. Her marriage deteriorated in 1927 after Christian Burr suspected her of infidelity. In the same year, her father passed away. She never made it to his bedside before his passing. Grieving, Annie completely gave up the craft of carpentry and changed her last name back to Berntsen. Christian Burr moved on and remarried, but Annie couldn't. In 1935, she showed up at his house, threatening his wife and daughter with a loaded revolver. She was then hospitalized and diagnosed with schizophrenia. She would spend the rest of her life, all 47 years of it, in a psychiatric hospital, and died alone as patient number 4,791. It's only recently that Annie's story is being remembered and told. I first came across the name of her business in a record of 40 years of Danish design by Greta Hjalk. Slowly, through multiple archival searches, I came across her interviews and opinions across old newspaper articles. And as I was submitting my thesis on women in Danish design history, an article in Politiken came out with her story. Annie was a pioneer in the world of carpentry, and although her legacy is somewhat a sad one, I really admire the strength it must have taken to achieve what she did, having her own crafts business under her own name in a time period where this shocked and scandalized people.